Week 7 is officially here, and today I got you guys covered with my top 36 wide receivers in the tier list format I bring you guys every Saturday, going through my wide receiver 1s, my wide receiver 2s, my wide receiver 3s, and my favorite flex plays entering this week of fantasy football. It is crunch time. It's time to start racking the W's. Before we get into the wide receiver tier list, though, we go through the will they play tier. Again, general rule of thumb, we want to be tracking the reports for these guys going into the weekend. All the 4 names that I have mentioned on the will they play tier this week are listed as true questionables, as we'll get into. But we'll start off with Cooper Kupp. Again, Deepak over at SportMD Analysis on Twitter describes Kupp as a true questionable entering this game, with the data favoring him sitting in this matchup. He is still dealing with that ankle injury he suffered in week 2 against Arizona, but he practiced limited all week. Again, if you need a pivot, Jordan Whittington is a very good option. He is expected to play in this game. And as we know, with Kupp and Nakua out of the lineup, Whittington has operated that Cooper Kupp type of role. So if you do have Cooper Kupp, make sure you do grab Jordan Whittington if he is available on your wire. And that is a perfect transition to be able to make. If Cooper Kupp plays, he is a top 8 wide receiver in my rankings. Next up, Deontay Johnson of the Carolina Panthers. He is suffering what's being described as ribs, hamstring, and ankle injuries entering the weekend. He didn't practice, and had a limited practice on Friday between his Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday sessions, and it feels like he is a true questionable entering Sunday. He's played through an ankle injury in the last 2 weeks, and if he does suit up against Washington, he is a must-start option, a top 15 wide receiver for me if he plays. And then Ladd McConkey, he was limited in practice on Thursday and Friday with what is being described as a hip injury, and his status is up in the air for Monday's game versus Arizona. Monitor his practice status on Saturday, and if he does go this week, he is a top 30 wide receiver in my rankings. And then finally, Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders. He is already listed as doubtful. It does not look like he will be playing in this game. Hasn't officially gotten ruled out yet, but the doubtful on Friday is a sign that he will be ruled out for this weekend. So if you do have Jacoby Myers, again, if he does play, I just don't want to be having him in my lineup given how serious the injury does sound at this point. And if he did play, he would be a fringe wide receiver 4 for me in my rankings. Ergo, if you have Jacoby Myers, you probably have a better pivot option regardless. But now we move on to the top 12 wide receivers, and I'll start off with my wide receivers 1 and 5 respectively. Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings and Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. Obviously, big pivotal divisional matchup. Detroit traveling on the road to play the Minnesota Vikings. Vikings implied for 26 points. Detroit implied for 24.5 points as 1.5-point road underdogs. With Justin Jefferson, I mean, he has commanded a 35% seasonal target share this year. And like we mentioned, we know the offensive insulation is there for Minnesota. 26 implied points this week. With Justin Jefferson, he is the best wide receiver in the NFL in a smash game environment, with Sam Darnold performing above his expectations. It's very close at the top, but in my opinion, I feel like Justin Jefferson is the most secure player to put as my wide receiver 1 this week. And on the flip side, Amon-Ra St. Brown is also secure. 3 of his 5 games with over 20 PPR points. 94% of the sharp money is on the over in this game, and as we know with Amon-Ra, he is the number 1 weapon on a top 5 level Detroit Lions offense. Weekly high-end wide receiver 1 projection, even if he doesn't have quite the high-end ceiling, number 1 overall wide receiver ceiling as some of the other guys in this range, given the other Lions weapons in my opinion. But moving on to another divisional affair, we have Malik Nabers as my wide receiver 2, A.J. Brown as my wide receiver 4 this week. Obviously, Philadelphia traveling on the road to play the New York Giants. Starting with Malik Nabers, I mean, again, both these guys you can argue as being the wide receiver 1 overall this week, but we'll start off with Malik Nabers. The Eagles are currently the worst in the NFL in defensive DVOA against opposing wide receivers, and it sounds like Malik Nabers is fully healthy entering this game. 39% seasonal target share, 22.9 PPR points per game. Nabers is quite literally having the greatest rookie season we have ever seen at the wide receiver position. On the flip side, A.J. Brown has been unbelievable in both games he suited up for the Eagles this year. 23.3 PPR points per game, 35% seasonal target share in those 2 games. He has looked unreal. 54% of the air yards as well. He is an absolute lock on a week-to-week basis. He is expected to be shadowed by Deonte Banks in this game, but Brown is an elite enough talent to flat out win that matchup straight up. Both these guys are smashes. Both these guys are top 4 wide receivers for me this week. And then coming in at number 3, we have Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals, 23.5 implied Bengals points on the road against Cleveland this week. The Bengals offense has been number 1 in neutral pass rate in the NFL in the last month, and Chase has averaged 20.1 PPR points per game on the year. Cleveland has been a bottom 10 defense against opposing wide receivers so far this season, and this Bengals passing offense has been a different type of juggernaut this year. I can comfortably project Chase Chase is a high-end wide receiver 1 on a week-to-week basis, and as we'll get into a little bit later, T. Higgins is a set top 15 level projection for me. Next up, another matchup, we have my wide receiver 6, Drake London, facing off against my wide receiver 10, DK Metcalf this week. Seattle traveling on the road to play the Falcons. Falcons implied for 27.25 points. The Seahawks implied for 24.25. We'll start off with Drake London. He has been incredible since week 2, and he fully deserves high-end wide receiver 1 status. This tweet from Mark over here, since week 2, a 24%, 31%, 34%, 25%, and 33% first rate target share. This guy has been an absolute alpha. He is in the Cooper Kupp role of the Zach Robinson offense. He has shown true development as a 3-level wide receiver. Seattle's defense has been very unimpressive in their last few games, and this Atlanta offense has caught in fire. And on the flip side, DK Metcalf has a 23% seasonal target share and a 41% air yard share on the year. He's had a rough last couple of weeks, but he had 3 straight games of over 15 PPR points between weeks 2 and 4 this season. This is a get-right spot, very good game environment, second highest over-under, and fastest pace of the entire slate. Wide receiver 7 is Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 22.75 implied Bucs points at home against the Baltimore Ravens this week. Godwin is currently the wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy, and he has been an alpha wide receiver despite sharing the field with Mike Evans. He is in the Cooper Kupp role. I just mentioned it with Drake London and Zach Robinson's scheme. He is in the Cooper Kupp role for Liam Cohn's offense in Tampa Bay, and this is a pass funnel Ravens defense. Godwin looks like one of the biggest steals in fantasy this year, and there are no signs of him potentially slowing down. And then going back to back here, wide receivers 8 and 9, we have Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers, and we have Stephon Diggs of the Houston Texans. Green Bay implied for 25.5 points at home. The Houston Texans implied for 22.5 on the road this week. We'll start off with Jaden Reed. I mean, he's coming in banged up in this game, so monitor his status going into Sunday. However, by all accounts, it does sound like he's ready to go, and he is the explosive threat of this offense. No Dontavian Wicks in this game, the second most consistent target for Jordan Love this year, and Reed is currently the wide receiver 4 overall in fantasy football. Obviously, tethered to Jordan Love, explosive Green Bay offense, Jaden Reed is a must-start wide receiver 1 on a week-to-week basis. And with Stephon Diggs, we even saw his role uptick with no Nico Collins on the field. This was a guy that we know was a hyper target in this Houston offense, but we even saw his air yard share go up this week with no Nico Collins. 38% air yard share this past week, the highest he has had across the season. 5 of 6 games with double-digit plus PPR points, and in this game environment, we have the 5th highest over-under and 96% of the money on the over. We're expecting a shootout between the Packers and Texans. Wide receiver 11 for me is Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders, hosting the Carolina Panthers this week. 30.5 implied Commanders points, and it's time I give Terry McLaurin some flowers. I mean, he's been a top 20 wide receiver for the last month and is coming off of a wide receiver 5 overall game. 30.5 implied Washington points, like I mentioned, and a 27% seasonal target share for McLaurin. He's been taking his production to a next level with this improved overall offensive environment. Cliff Kingsbury's in his bag. Jaden Daniels looking like the rookie of the year so far. And until he shows me why he shouldn't be in this range, McLaurin will be a high-end wide receiver 2 or better week to week in my rankings moving forward. Moving on to my final wide receiver in the wide receiver 1 range, we have Deebo Samuel coming in at 12, 24.25 implied Niners points this week. And the worry for Deebo Samuel is potential separation issues against a man-heavy Chiefs defense. However, with Mason coming into this game banged up and the Niners having such a high implied total, I still think he is a must-start option this week. He's been a top 15 weekly wide receiver in 3 of his 5 games this year, and outside of one bad week 5, he has scored over 10 plus PPR points in each game. The Niners will score points in this game, and I want the guy that gets touches in multiple ways. That is exactly what Deebo Samuel is. But you need to start these guys, so we'll spend some more time in the 13 to 36 area. Of course, I'm diving into my full top 36 wide receivers. If you guys want access to my quarterbacks, running backs, full wide receiver list, and of course my tight end rankings, there is one of 2 ways to access the weekly rankings manifesto right now. First way, Underdog Fantasy, promo code FSE. If you sign up and first deposit at least $10, make one play on the site, you will get access to our weekly rankings manifesto, the best resource in your 2024 fantasy season. The other way is by going over to flockfantasy.com. If you use promo code FSC, you will get 30% off any site-wide package, as well as a 7-day free trial on the site. You'll get access to our weekly rankings manifesto, like I said, the main resource for your 2024 fantasy football seasons. But we'll move on to the wide receiver 13 for me this week, and that starts off with Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. And Smith has quietly been between 14 to 21 PPR points in every single game he's played this year, and while he hasn't quite had that elite blow-up week, he's been incredibly consistent in your your lineup. He's played 70+% of the snaps in the slot in the 2 games that A.J. Brown has suited up. And with 23 implied points on the road and Banks expected to shadow Brown in this game, maybe this is the ceiling week for Devontae Smith. Wide receiver 14 is T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals, 23.5 implied Bengals points on the road against Cleveland this week. And with T. Higgins, he has a 28% target share since returning to the lineup, and he has averaged 15.7 PPR points per game. This is a high-paced, high-volume passing offense with a consolidated target hierarchy with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. And the Bengals are an extremely easy offense to trust at this point, given the sample size of what we've seen. And then wide receivers 15 and 16, respectively, for me, are Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens and Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Obviously, Baltimore, like I mentioned with Godwin, traveling on the road to play the Buccaneers this week. They are currently 3.5-point favorites on the road, 26.25 implied Ravens points, 22.75 implied Bucs points in this matchup. This is a great game environment in this one, and both of these offenses have been humming this year. Flowers is coming off a monster game against Washington, and he has been extremely productive in the non-blowout game scripts for the Baltimore Ravens this season. 9+ targets in 4 of his 6 games when the game has been within reach of the other team. For Mike Evans, he comes into this game banged up, but Bucs reporters are expecting him to play on Monday Night Football. Yes, it is a bit risky knowing that he didn't practice on Friday, but it does sound like more load management from Tampa according to their main reporters. Make sure you have a pivoting case, but I'd be confident in Mike Evans getting back on track on Monday in a very good matchup against Baltimore. Like I said, a pass funnel defense. Wide receiver 17 for me is Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. Cardinals hosting the LA Chargers on Monday Night Football. With Marvin Harrison Jr., obviously he suffered the concussion last week, but he did practice in full on Friday and is fully on track to play this week. His season has been a bit of a mixed bag so far, but it really just boils down to he is an alpha wide receiver on what I expect to be a good performing offense this week. Hopefully we can see him get back to the level we saw in weeks 2 to 4, 25 targets in those 3 games and 18.3 PPR points per game. And I believe in the talent for him to bounce back. And then wide receiver 18 is Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, 20 implied points for the Jets at home against Pittsburgh this week. It is a tougher matchup. It is a new offensive dynamic working with another wide receiver like Davante Adams in this wide receiver core. However, although I do think Wilson sees a downtick from his dominant target share across the last few games, the offensive efficiency and the value of those targets should go up with Davante Adams on the field. Like we mentioned with Garrett, he's been dominant in the past 2 games, but I do question what his target split looks like between him and Davante Adams. That, combined with a tough matchup against a good Steelers defense, knocks Wilson down to mid-range wide receiver 2 status, despite how good he's been playing. And we may as well just combine that with 19 on my list, because I do have his teammate Davante Adams coming in at 19. He is so incredibly hard to gauge because on one hand, he has an elite rapport with Aaron Rodgers, obviously with the years they've worked together, clearly coordinated this trade behind the scenes. I mean, on the McAfee show that Rodgers appeared in, Davante Adams made a surprise appearance. So we know that they are very close. We know that they obviously have the rapport in the past, and we know that Aaron Rodgers pushed for this trade to happen. However, on the glass half empty side, this is an old wide receiver getting traded after missing time with a hamstring injury, and I do think there is risk to this deal. Again, there's a very real possibility that the hamstring injury was fabricated. He wanted to get traded. That's why he used the hamstring injury as leverage, and I think that probably is what happened. However, knowing there is some risk and knowing there's quality wide receivers in this range, I still have Davante Adams at 19. He could very much be the wide receiver 1 on the Jets moving forward, though, knowing the connection he has with Rodgers. And then wide receivers 20 and 24 also play against each other. Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers and Juju Smith-Schuster of the Kansas City Chiefs. Like I mentioned, 24.25 implied Niners points in this game, 22.75 implied Chiefs points. And with Brandon Ayuk, he's been a fantasy disappointment so far, only the wide receiver 41 on the season. However, like I mentioned in the trade targets video, I do think there are greener pastures for Brandon Ayuk moving forward. And this very much feels like a squeaky wheel spot for him. KC runs a ton of man defense where Ayuk thrives versus Debo struggles. So while I can't put him above Debo based off what we've seen this year, I would not be shocked if this was Brandon Ayuk's get right spot, knowing how he is a better separator against man than Debo. And then Juju comes in as a top 24 wide receiver for me, quite simply because he was in the Rashee Rice role in week 5. Reed has confirmed that he expects Juju to play, and his role is a moneymaker for fantasy. That's all I really have to add here. I mean, it doesn't feel great having Juju Smith-Schuster as a top 24 wide receiver by week 7, but that is what fantasy football has brought us. I mean, I wish I could be talking about Rashee Rice as the top 5 wide receiver, but unfortunately, given the injury and Juju, how good he was in that role last week, has to be a wide receiver 2 for me moving forward until he proves otherwise. Wide receiver 21 for me is Tank Dell of the Houston Texans, 22.5 implied Texans points. And I was extremely nervous about Dell last week. I thought he didn't look the same after the fractured fibula. I thought that maybe he just wouldn't be the same player this year. And in his first game without Nico Collins, he bounced back in a big way. 18.7 PPR points, 31% target share in that game. And while there could be an issue with Jair Alexander expected to play, him potentially facing a lot of snaps on the outside, this Texans offense is something that I can trust on a week-to-week basis. And as long as Tank Dell shows the talent level he showed last year, like he did this past week, I will be trusting him as a wide receiver 2 until Nico Collins comes back. Wide receiver 22 is Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins, 20.25 implied Dolphins points on the road against the Colts this week. And as we know, Hill would be a high-end wide receiver 1 the moment that Tua gets back. But for now, even with Hundley, I think you can comfortably start him as the top 24 option. A 30+% target share in back-to-back games with Hundley, and a 40+% air yard share in each of those 2 games. He was a wide receiver 26 on the week in week 5, has the bye week in week 6 to develop some more rapport with Hundley, and I do expect that to continue against an Indianapolis pass defense that has seeded big plays all year. And then we go to Brian Thomas Jr. coming in at 23.75 implied Jags points in London against the Patriots this week. He has been phenomenal as a rookie so far, yet it has felt like some of the production has been left on the field. I mean, Trevor Lawrence has missed BTJ down the field a few times. Obviously, last week in London, BTJ drops that touchdown. Despite how dominant he's been so far, I feel like there's so much meat left on the bone. But this is also giving my flowers to Christian Gonzalez, who has played at an all-pro level this year and is expected to shadow Brian Thomas Jr. in this game. Brian Thomas is downright the talent to be able to win this matchup. But again, I'm giving my flowers to Christian Gonzalez and lowering BTJ from the weekly top 15, top 16 wide receiver I'll have him at to a low-end wide receiver 2 given the matchup. But moving on to my wide receiver 3s, and on the flip side of that London game, I have Demario Douglas coming in at 25. Only 17.75 implied Patriots points this week, but I do think this is one of the mispriced offenses in the entire Week 7 slate. This is the easiest matchup on the matchup chart against opposing wide receivers, and Demario Douglas has stepped up as this true Patriots wide receiver 1. And Gerard Mayo has already confirmed he will increase Douglas' snaps moving forward, potentially getting him in more 2 wide receiver sets, which also gives Douglas a higher floor on a week-to-week basis. May was a huge injection to this offense this past week, and Douglas has 9 targets in back-to-back games. I trust Drake May. I think he is a superstar level talent, and I think he's going to be able to increase the viability of the entire offense around him, and I think Pop Douglas is his wide receiver 1 go-to wide receiver this week. A similar archetype to Pop Douglas, we have at wide receiver 26 this week, Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts, 23.25 implied points for the Colts at home this week. And Downs is another game away from being a weekly top 24 wide receiver. He's been a top 20 guy in each of his last 3 games, and he just saw the highest route rate of his season this past week. The passing volume may decrease with Anthony Richardson starting at quarterback rather than Joe Flacco, but Downs has proven himself to be the Colts wide receiver 1 from a fantasy perspective. He was limited with a toe injury, but he confirmed on Kay Adams' show that he is fully ready to go on Sunday. And then wide receivers 27 and 30 respectively. I already talked about, the wide receiver 1s on each of the respective teams, but now we move on to those wide receiver 2s. Jordan Addison, Jamison Williams, obviously big pivotal divisional matchup with the Lions taking on the Vikings. And for these wide receivers, again, this is a smash spot, top 4 in pace, top 4 in over-under, and top 4 in sharp money percentage on the over. For Jordan Addison's case, I trust him a little bit more than Jamison Williams, but both are volatile, big play threats on their respective offenses. The reason why I do trust Addison, though, is that he just had his season high in terms of both route share and target share in week 5, 97% of the routes, 29% of the targets. So despite the production not being there, the peripherals are looking good, and that's why I do prefer him to Jamison Williams, because with Jamison Williams, if you watch the trade target show, I think he's one of the biggest sell highs in fantasy football. He hasn't topped a 15+% target share since week 2, and as we know, he's gotten there on big plays, explosive plays down the field. The Vikings have been a top 5 defense in average yards allowed per play this year. And although I do recognize that Jamison Williams has the upside to bite me in this spot, I'd prefer more involved options in this range than Jamison Williams. And then wide receivers 28 and 29 respectively, another cross matchup here. Darnell Mooney of the Atlanta Falcons coming in at 28. Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks coming in at 29. And I mentioned this with the matchup earlier, but this is a smash spot for your Falcons and Seahawks players, with Darnell Mooney a 23% seasonal target share, and he has averaged 13.7 PPR points per game, 27.25 implied points. Like I said, he'll continue being a rock solid option as long as the Atlanta offense is as hot as it's been in the recent weeks. For JSN on the flip side, a little bit disappointing based on the expectations I had for him coming into the year. Only a 20% target share, only 11.8 PPR points per game. I did expect more from him moving into year 2. However, it is a good matchup. The Seahawks have been extremely pass happy, and Lockett is entering this game banged up. Maybe we do see JSN take a step like I thought he could entering the season. Closing off with my flex plays, wide receiver 31 is Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants. He's been a target monster for this Giants offense this year, whether or not Neighbors has been on the field. Very advantageous matchup, like I mentioned, with Philadelphia this week. And he has scored over 10 plus PPR points in all but one game this season. I don't think he has an extremely high, wide receiver 6 overall type of ceiling on any given week. But given the level of target involvement, given, the PPR scam usage around the line of scrimmage, I think he is a safe top 36 weekly option. Some weeks he's going to be closer to, wide receiver 18, wide receiver 20. Other weeks he's going to be closer to wide receiver 35, 36. Wide receiver 32 is Amari Cooper of now the Buffalo Bills. And he's someone I really struggled to put in my rankings this week because on one side, of course, the talent, working with Josh Allen, high implied point environment for the Buffalo Bills offense. The peripherals say, top 20 wide receiver. However, as we know with the context in the NFL, he gets traded this past week, hasn't really had a full time to acclimate to this offense, maybe sees, 50, 60% of the snaps. And that is the worry with Amari Cooper, that he doesn't get a full route share. However, I do think the upside at this wide receiver 32 spot is enough for me to take on the risk for Amari Cooper. Again, he would be a weekly top 20 level option if I knew he had 100% of the routes this week. But knowing there is uncertainty in his usage, I did dock him back down to flex play territory. Wide receiver 33 is George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And yes, this is a very tough matchup going up against Sauce Gardner and this Jets secondary. However, there is potential added life to this passing game with Russ expected to make his first start this week. Pickens has been an alpha wide receiver this year, 29% target share, 47% air yard share. And as we know with Russell Wilson, although he may be a little washed from his time in Seattle, what we saw last year, for example, with Denver, is him being able to feed a vertical X wide receiver in Courtland Sutton, and that is exactly what Pickens represents to this offense. The other concern is, does Arthur Smith cut his snaps? Is he a 67% route share player? That's always going to be baked into Pickens' risk level on a week-to-week basis, but as we know, the upside as a vertical X wide receiver with Russell Wilson, who is comfortable throwing to the boundary, is enough to have him as a top 36 wide receiver. Wide receiver 34 is Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. I already mentioned his teammate with BTJ. I already mentioned his counterpart with Demario Douglas. Well, with Christian Kirk, he saw his route share increase back this past week up to 79% of the routes. And like I mentioned with BTJ, Christian Kirk does have the easier of the Jags wide receiver matchups this week, working from the slot and away from Christian Gonzalez. Nearly 24 implied points for this Jags offense. And I think this could be a sneaky shootout spot, knowing how much the Jags defense has struggled this year. And it's always a risk with the London game, but I do trust the upside that Kirk has shown with Trevor Lawrence, even if it hasn't been consistent on a week in, week out basis. And coming in at 35 is Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers, over 25 implied Packers points. He returns to the top 36 after a 2-touchdown outing this past week. No Dontavian Wicks, and Reed enters the game banged up like I mentioned earlier. This is a high implied Green Bay offensive total, and Doubs looks like he'll have consistent snaps now after a mini holdout this past week. And then finally, closing off this video at wide receiver 36, we have Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. Worthy hasn't quite commanded the volume we'd like to see after that explosive week 1, but coming off of a bye where we have historically seen rookie wide receivers have a post-bye bump in the past, I am excited for the potential, the upside for Xavier Worthy moving forward. He's very similar in terms of archetype to Jameson Williams. He has the type of explosive profile that can turn a matchup on its head. I do expect Juju Smith-Schuster to be the wide receiver 1 given the Rashee Rice role, but maybe this is the usage breakout game for Xavier Worthy, knowing that he has the bye week under his belt. But either way, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. Like I mentioned in the middle of the video, if you want access to our weekly rankings moving forward, one of 2 ways to access them. First way, Underdog Fantasy, promo code FSC. Sign up and first deposit at least $10. Make one play on the site, and you will get access to those weekly rankings every single week. The other way is by going over to flockfantasy.com. Promo code FSC, 30% off of any site-wide package, as well as a 7-day free trial on the site to explore some of the options we have available over there. But with that being said, peace out. Good luck in your Week 7 matchups. Let's take care of business.